So we're going to start tonight talking about the history of hymnody, and what I'm going to try to do is connect a little bit about what we talked about in music history, but we didn't really talk about where hymns came from as we went through music history. The majority of church music that we talked about was really more the music that was performed by either a more professional or well-trained volunteer choir or ensemble in the church. But hymns, the kind of songs that were for the entire congregation or the people to sing, is a whole other kind of genre, but it also has some really interesting history in itself. This is from a writing. The gentleman writing is Niceta Ramasian. I don't know if that's the actual correct pronunciation, but who was a 4th century bishop, lived circa 335 to 414 AD. And he was a bishop of the Dacians, which I know nothing about and have never heard of, but now he is the patron saint of Romania. And this is the first writing that we find about any sort of singing and music utilized kind of congregationally or group music in the church, what we call liturgical singing. Now, this top phrase, it is a fact that hymns as an act of worship was introduced from the East in the years 373 that split the West, because there is no command, example, or inference of any godly people ever performing congregational singing with or without instruments. Sorry, oh shoot, what did I just do?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Keep It.
I went forward without. Sorry, I'm trying to move you all so I can read the whole thing because you're in the way. Your faces are in the way. Of any godly people ever performing congregational singing with or without instruments, scholars wonder why early church history is so silent. So what they're really saying is that they don't really believe prior to this 373 that there was any sort of congregational singing. Now, we know from the Bible, from Paul, that there was definitely singing. We know that the Psalms most likely were sung, but we don't have any extant tunes left for them. So we know that music was definitely present in worship, even in biblical times, but we don't really have any idea of this congregational or even choral singing prior to 373. And so this is what this gentleman who was a bishop, and he wrote sermons that have been recorded and written down. And these sermons, one of them was how should singing happen in the church. And so these were the rules that he states as a bishop in 373. I must not bore you, beloved, with more details of the history of the Psalms. It is time to turn to the New Testament to confirm what is said in the Old, and particularly to point out that the office of psalmody is not to be considered abolished merely because many other observances of the Old Law have fallen into desuetude. And I don't really know that word very well, but not use is what it means. So what he's saying is at this moment, there's actually an argument, because we have some semblance of the New Testament happening in the writings, or what they're using as their biblical scriptures, that some people are saying anything in the Old Testament can no longer be practiced. And so there's an argument happening, and he's saying that's not true. We can still sing the Psalms. And one of the things we know about the Catholic Church, even farther into this time, is that they weren't allowed to sing texts unless they were in the Bible. You couldn't just write your own random text. It had to be biblical texts. And then as the Catholic Church developed its own Latin texts for liturgy, then those started to also get used as well. But basically, some people are saying, nope, you can't sing the Psalms, they're Old Testament. And he's saying, yes, you can. Then he says, only the corporal institutions have been rejected, like circumcision, the Sabbath, sacrifices, discrimination in foods. So too, the trumpets, harps, cymbals, and timbrels. So he's saying you can't have trumpets, harps, cymbals, and timbrels. That's bad. That's really awful to have those instruments. But that's just like the rules in the Old Testament. But you can still have singing. For the sound of these, we now have a better substitute in the music from the mouths of human beings. He uses the term men. The daily ablutions, the new moon observances, the careful inspection of leprosy are completely past and gone, along with whatever else was necessary only for a time, as it were, for children, because of transgression. I am aware that there are some among us, and some in the eastern provinces too, who hold that there is something superfluous, not to say suspicious, about the singing of hymns and psalms during divine service. Their idea is that it is unrestrained to utter with the tongue what is enough to say with the heart. So there are some people arguing that you can speak collectively the psalms, but you cannot sing them, that it's evil to sing them. They base their opinion on a text from the Apostles' Epistle to the Ephesians. Be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your hearts to the Lord. So that they're pointing out the in your hearts part, that you can sing inside yourself, but you cannot do it collectively and out loud. There, they say, you have the apostles stating that we should sing in our hearts and not make a noise with musical notes, like people on the stage. For God, who searches the heart, it is enough, they insist, if our song be silent and in the heart. I take a different view. There is nothing wrong, of course, with singing in the heart. In fact, it is always good to meditate with the heart on the things of God. But I also think that there is something praiseworthy when people glorify God with the sound of their voices. Now, part of this is important to note that he says, like people on the stage, because one of the things about the Catholic Church is they were always trying to set apart what was sacred and what was secular. And so if it was being done on the stage, it may not be really legal or appropriate to do in church. And so there's this constant battle that you will continue to see, and we talked a little bit about it when we got into talking about opera and oratorios and that sort of thing, of what is sacred and what is secular in art and music in the church. So, but this gives us, this is the very first time post the Bible that singing and music is really talked about, especially collective singing, in any writings in the church post the Bible and before modern times. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Just interesting to see. Was there a question? It's just interesting to see that, our arguments about what music is appropriate and how we do music in church started in the 300s and still continues today. All right, so now I've got this great video of this gentleman who's going to walk us through kind of post the 300s, kind of what happens and what music looks like in the church. You're going to hear some things that you recognize, like chant, Gregorian chant, Pope Gregory, and that sort of thing, but you're also going to hear a little bit more. But what we really understand is that there was some psalm singing happening in the 300s, and then the Catholic Church started to really define who was allowed to sing, what words were allowed to be sung, and all of these things. And so that's what this gentleman's going to go through. It's about 11 minutes, but it's a really great video with lots of good graphics to show you texts and music from that time period.
Hello everyone and welcome to Keep It Classical, where today we talk about the music of the early Christian church. It's important to talk about the early Christian church because so much of the music during the next 1,000 years or so is inseparably intertwined with Christianity. But don't worry, you don't have to be a Christian to understand and appreciate the context of this art. We're going to talk about religion in an objective way so that we can more fully appreciate where this music comes from. Let's get started. We don't really have the time to go through all the nitty-gritty details of the early Christian church. This is a music channel after all. So here's a very brief summary of its history. The Christian church really begins at the last Passover feast of Jesus of Nazareth, where he breaks bread and shares wine of, quote, the New Testament with his disciples. This is now referred to as the Last Supper. Jesus is then crucified by the Romans at the behest of members of the Sanhedrin. According to the New Testament, 3 days later, Jesus rises from the tomb and visits his disciples. After 40 days on earth, Jesus ascends to heaven. Peter and the disciples are given charge to lead the church. The Holy Ghost falls on them in what we now call the day of Pentecost. They proselytize to different territories outside Judea. Apostles and Christians are martyred for their beliefs. The church continues to expand. Emperor Constantine becomes converted. A year later, Constantine legalizes Christianity in the Roman Church. He gathers a group of religious leaders and thinkers to Nicaea to codify religious beliefs. Theodosius I then makes Christianity the official religion. Different regions, to be called dioceses, are overseen by various leaders to be called bishops, with the Bishop of Rome leading them all and being called the Pope. Religious rites and modes of worship begin to be codified and standardized. A calendar of important dates to observe begins to be kept. Increasing political and theological tensions between the West, Rome, and the East, Constantinople, lead to the Great Schism, which forever separated the two. The West became known as the Roman Catholic Church, and the East became known as the Byzantine Church, and later the Orthodox Church. Okay, let's stop there. Take a breather. We only got to the year 1054. A lot happens here. Moving forward, we're going to focus the majority of our time on music associated with the Roman Catholic Church, because a large amount of classical music is associated with it. But the Orthodox Church has a rich history associated with it as well, and we will come back and revisit classical music that comes from this tradition at a later point. Let's go back and trace the development of music through all of that. Let's start with the Last Supper, which is where we first see music mentioned in the Christian Church. In the Gospel according to Matthew, when the supper had ended, it reads, "And when they had sung an hymn, they went out into the Mount of Olives." A hymn is a poem or song to use in religious worship or praise. The hymn they're referring to probably came from their Judaic tradition, very likely a Psalm of David. As the church grew, singing continued to be an important part of worship. These songs used in worship have become known as plain chant or plain song. They are sung in what's called monophony, or one voice. Different styles or dialects of chant began to pop up in different regions. Eventually, the local dialects were replaced with one specific style of chant called Gregorian chant. They're called Gregorian because they're attributed to Pope Gregory. Legend has it that the Holy Ghost, in the form of a dove, sang the chants to Gregory, who then dictated them. It's a good story, but like most good stories, it's probably not true. Just like Harry Potter. Sorry, kids. The chants were probably notated closer to 2 centuries after the Pope's Gregory's. Let's listen to an example of plain chant. But before we do, let's talk about some things to listen for. Is the melody smooth and stepwise, or does it have lots of leaps in it? Is it mostly sung with 1 note per syllable, or sung with lots of notes per syllable, or something in between? Finally, how big is the vocal range? Is it less than an octave, larger than an octave? Here's an example called Viderunt omnes. What did you hear as far as melodic smoothness? It's got a few leaps in there, but overall it's pretty stepwise, with most of the intervals being 1/3 or smaller. Also, it has a lot of notes per syllable, doesn't it? When there are lots of notes per syllable, we call that melismatic. If it's 1 or 2 notes per syllable, we call that syllabic. Also, the vocal range is fairly conservative. It stays close to 1 octave. These are all pretty typical attributes for Gregorian chant and will prevail in church music for hundreds of years to come. Let's talk about the words for a bit. Viderunt omnes is a chant for Christmas Day, which inspires a new discussion about when this music was sung. As we talked about in a previous video, some music is written for specific occasions in mind. The early Roman Church began to codify different periods of time to observe different events in the life of Jesus of Nazareth. These include the time before Jesus' birth, the day Jesus' birth is celebrated, and a period after that, Jesus being taken to the temple by his parents according to Jewish customs, the 40 days leading up to the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus and the 40 days he spent on earth before his ascension, the time after the Holy Ghost fell upon the disciples, and the rest of the year before it all starts over again. This is called the liturgical calendar and continues to be used by many Christian denominations all over the world. Different chants are sung at different times of the year, depending on where you are in the calendar. Again, some music is appropriate for some situations and inappropriate for others. Now we get to talk about the best known composer of this admittedly vast time period, Hildegard von Bingen. Hildegard was a German nun who took her vows at the age of 14. She was kind of a triple threat. She composed music, she wrote poetry, and she wrote about medicine. Most notable was that she claimed to see visions and speak prophecies. Eventually, she founded her own convent near Bingen, where she taught and wrote extensively. Hildegard's music is written in monophony, just like chant, and at first glance and listen, it can sound a lot like the chant that we heard before. However, Hildegard's music is much more adventurous in comparison. Remember how the previous chant that we heard was mostly smooth and stepwise? Hildegard's music involves more leaps. The previous chant was melismatic. Hildegard takes it a step further with extended melismas. And staying close to an octave, Hildegard regularly writes beyond an octave, and in some instances to an octave and a fifth. Let's take a listen. Hildegard, in many ways, is a thinker ahead of her time. The most fascinating work of Hildegard has to be what's known as her liturgical drama, Ordo Virtutum, or the Virtues. This is a large dramatic musical work, sung in Latin, that would best be described as a morality play. It contains various fictional characters, like virtue, mercy, innocence, chastity, the penitent soul, and the devil. What's most interesting about it is that every character gets to sing except the devil, who only speaks.
Ego autem pugna mea, deficiam te!
Ego omnes vias meas malas esse quod novi.
This shows, in stark fashion, his separation from God, and reiterates the Church's ideal that music is a gift from God and meant for worship and prayer. I think at this point, we should talk about how music and the Church have always had, at best, an uneasy truce between each other. This unease goes as far back as St. Augustine, who wrote, "When I recall the tears that I shed at the song of the Church in the first days of my recovered faith, and now, as I am moved not by the song, but by the things which are sung, I acknowledge the great benefit of this practice. Yet when it happens that I am moved more by the song than by what is sung, I confess sinning grievously, and I would prefer not to hear the singer at such times." I think it's that poor singer. In other words, the music distracts me from the intended message. On the other hand, Claudio Monteverdi is attributed to saying, "The end of all good music is to affect the soul." In other words, music itself can inspire us to be better. The Church did make it possible for lots of amazing music to eventually be written, but under an untrusting eye. Musicians in turn have sometimes seen the Church as necessary for their livelihoods, but sometimes overbearing towards their art. The essence of musical history can be distilled down to this. The Church says, "Please make music, but don't get too crazy." To which the musicians replied, "Oh, we gon' get crazy." That's all for now. Next time, we'll talk about the High Middle Ages and the birth of polyphony. If you heard something that you...
So, I just liked the way he broke down the kind of mixed relationship that the church has had with music, and I think that a lot of times when we talk about everything from praise music and drums and everything, that we have this sense that we're having an argument that's new, and ultimately the church has been arguing about what voices, what kind of music, what instruments were appropriate for the church and for praising God and for whatever else worship is intended for, since its inception of using music. So I love that. The other thing I wanted to point out is the morality play that Hildegard von Bingen wrote. The interesting thing about that is the birth of utilizing theater in the church. So what happened in the Catholic Church is that all of the texts the Catholic Church is using in the early Catholic Church is in Latin. But at this point, we understand that only the rich and the royals were really the people that were, and the priests were the people that were educated enough to sing and read and understand Latin. And so the church had this real big problem because they needed people to come to church and to feel that the church is important in their lives. But when people came to sit through church, 99% of what they experienced was language they couldn't understand. It was like if we would go to a foreign country and sit through church every Sunday and try to get something out of it without learning the language. And so they didn't want to dumb down the language, for lack of a better term, and so that instead they started allowing these things called morality plays, and these morality plays were originally done by people within the church like Hildegard von Bingen, but then they actually started to allow them to be done as community theater plays, and they ended up actually even splitting them up and kind of assigning them to different groups. So if you were a shoemaker, you would get together with the other shoemakers in the area, and you get assigned an area of the Bible story or a text that you would teach your moral about, and then another group, but they ended up teaching the morality of the church, or what is in the Bible morally, through these stories, oftentimes using parables and stories in the Bible too. But anyway, so that is the birth of morality play, is the birth of theater in Europe. The only thing prior to that we have in theater that we know of is the Greek theater that we know of, with the old Greek poets or playwrights. So anyway, so it's just interesting how much the church plays a role in the development of all of these art forms. All right, so any questions
Hello,
about
everyone.
what we heard from him before we move on? So speaking of this kind of dichotomy of the people they want to come to the church and to give money to the church and to spend time at the church, but then kind of not making it accessible. One of the very interesting things is that you saw that, or heard that a lot of the songs came from the Psalms. Well, this is an actual psalter, Psalter. And a psalter was a book that the Psalms were written down in, but they were written in Latin. Now this psalter, you'll notice, is really beautifully decorated, and it was very common if you were upper class, if you were rich, if you were well educated, that you would have a psalter in your home. Now notice there's no music written here, but there probably would have been tunes that you might have known to sing it, or you might have just spoken it out loud. But again, it was only the rich and the well-educated who had access to these kinds of psalters. But what you're going to start to see is that this term psalter is also what early hymn books were called, and we're going to look at this kind of evolution of the psalter as we go through. So this is a psalter that only has text, but is beautifully decorated, and would have been would have taken many years. Probably a group of monks would have written the text, and then so a monk that was good at drawing would have been assigned to decorate the pages. So then this is the next kind of version of the Psalter as we start to have music written. But again, notice how ornate, how beautiful. This kind of Psalter would have only been found either in the church itself or in the home of someone who was quite wealthy and quite educated. And I think we've looked a little bit at this kind of music before, but you'll see that the music looks very different from what we understand of written music today, because they're still developing the staff and notes and the ideas of lengths and all of that sort of thing. Now this would be, I'm not saying there's nothing in between these, but this would be kind of the next major inception of the Psalter. And there are, even in America, churches who still use Psalters that look more like this, especially in the Appalachian Mountains and in more older traditional churches like the Quakers and people like that. Oftentimes they still utilize a hymn book that looks very much like this, where the text is written separately and the tune is written above it. So this would have been the next kind of version of the Psalter. Now, as we start to get to this point, of course, they become cheaper for people to buy because the printing press is developed, and so we can actually produce these a little more mass at a less cost, and so more people can own these in their homes. Of course, also this version you're seeing is in English, because at some point the Protestant church requires that music be sung and that the church be held in the native language of the people attending the church. This is another version that you see, and you'll see this is called, I cut it off a little bit, sorry, but it says it's called the Plain Song Psalter. And this one is actually a modern Plain Song Psalter. I mean, modern not in the sense that it was created 2 days ago, but modern in that there are still churches using books that look exactly like this today. Now, the idea of the Psalter continues to be developed, and there were two very popular Psalters that were developed once the Protestant church started to bring the printing of biblical and religious texts into the language of the people. And these were the first two major English Psalters. So the first one was the Bay Psalm book, and we think that it was created around 1640. The other one is the Scottish Psalter in 1650. Now, why there's two different ones is there became an argument about the translations of the texts into English. Again, another argument that still is happening in the church today is who has the better translation of the original biblical psalms or texts. And so this is literally taking a psalm that we all know, right? Psalm 23, and then two different versions. Now you'll notice again that has a very poetic form, because these would have been written for them to be sung. Oftentimes in this period in the Protestant church, they were sung as a call and response. And you can again even find this, and I almost pulled some videos, but they're just really bad. But there's still churches today that sing in this style. So the lead singer would sing, "The Lord to me a shepherd is," and then the congregation would sing, "The Lord to me a shepherd is," and there would be a call and response for the entire hymn. And that is how they literally taught the music. Similar to how we still teach music today. We would oftentimes at the church we go to have me or Beth or somebody sing it once through to kind of teach it, and then have the congregation try it out. But this would have been what their hymn book would have looked like. Now, we start to then have to figure out, how do we get tunes to go along with these texts that we've printed? And as we talked about last week, it was really important for them to find tunes that people could find accessible and able to sing. And so in order to attach tunes to the texts, they would have to do a metrical system to count the number of syllables in each line and then figure out if the tune would fit. And so if you look here, and this is a tune a hymn we know, Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. So they're literally counting, come, one, thou, two, long, and so on and so forth. And so there's 8 syllables in that top phrase. Then the next phrase, born to set thy people free, is 7. Then the next one, from our fears and sins release us, 8. And then let us find our rest in thee, 7. Now, as we move through, I'm going to talk a lot more about kind of how we started getting to the point of people writing their own texts for hymns, but really the Methodist Church is the main reason, although a lot of people would give some credit to Luther as well, because Luther did write some hymns, but it's really the brothers that began the Methodist Church that are the main European hymn writers of the early Christian Protestant church. And so we'll get into that another day, because I have a lot of information on that for us to talk about. But that's where these texts that are not directly from Psalms are coming from. So then they would go, okay, we have a hymn that is 8-7-8-7, and then we need to find a tune that has those same number of syllables in the phrase. And most likely it has 8 notes in the first phrase, 7 notes in the next phrase, because oftentimes there's not very much multiple notes on a syllable. We pretty much would have 1 note per syllable. Is everybody following so far? Cool. Now this system looks very familiar because you're going to see it in just a minute. Why did I pull this? It's not very readable, is it? I'll have to come back and figure out what I was wanting to pull out of that, because I can't read it. Sorry, it looked better on my screen when I wasn't sharing, so I'll come back to that in a minute.
There seems to be a worldwide movement afoot, a rediscovery of actually singing the Psalms in our churches. It's been a personal discovery for me in the last few years, and it's helped my walk with Christ many of these Psalms, and they made me the original. So look with me at Psalm 100. It's a famous psalm used down the centuries to start our worship. The meter's given on the top right there. SM for short meter. So it's the first line is 6 syllables, and then 6 syllables, then 8 syllables, and then 6 syllables. Now this video is for musical amateurs like me, so bear with this amateur's voice, will you, as I sing. Crown him with many crowns. You know that tune? That's in that guide to metrical tunes. And it lists it as short meter, brackets D, D for double, which means that it goes through the 6-6-8-6 routine twice over. It should become clear. But the tune goes like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's 4 lines, and then you get another 4 lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The mood of the tune seems to fit Psalm 100 quite well. Well, let's have a look at Psalm 1. You've got 2 versions in the book here. So if you choose 1A.
So this gentleman's just showing us a little bit more about the meter. I forgot this was a video. But basically, this is one of the reasons why there's arguments over the translation of the psalm, because they're not only trying to translate the psalm, but they're trying to make it match some of the common metrics of the tunes that they have available. If it's a tune that everybody can sing and they can translate the psalm to match that tune, then it's going to be something they can utilize within their worship. And so this is very much, and so really until the late 19th century, you do not see hymn books where you have music and text like our hymn books today. That is a very modern practice. It is mostly either you just get the text and they tell you a meter that you would sing along to that, or you would sing that text to, and then you pick, oh, we have 2 tunes that is SM, the simple meter, and so we are going to sing this one to this today because that fits that text nicely. Then,
Eternal Lord doth reign as King,
So you can see that this didn't always make for the greatest text or translations of the Psalms. Sometimes the great and dreadful name for it is Holy Let Them Bless. I mean, it just is kind of awkward, especially in that tune. So there's definitely moments where it feels very strange. But this ultimately is how we get to the point where we get to a tune or a hymn like this that we utilize today. Now, this has a breakdown of the different parts of the tune. Some of them are very simple. Number one is of just the title of the hymn itself. Number two, you'll notice in our hymnal that we have sections. And so the opening of our hymnal is songs that are praise and thanksgiving. And the reason is that the original intent of both the Catholic and the Protestant Church of an opening song for worship is intended to be praiseworthy. And we see this thankful. And we see this even in the way that Jesus teaches praying in the Bible, right? That we are to start out first with thanking God, right? And then we move into asking things and other prayers that we have and concerns. And so this is something that's set up. And so these headings on number 2 are giving that for us. Number 3 is just the number of the hymn itself. Number 4 is the tune of the hymn, which is the top line. But again, this didn't really get brought in until the middle of the 19th century. Number 5 is the first verse, and then we have as many verses because this is a strophic hymn, which is really how all hymns for the most part are written, where we have a melody that we sing a number of different words to within the hymn. Number 6 is pointing out that it's the end of a section, and what you should really be looking at number 6 to compare is then look at number 8. Number 8 is telling you that is the end of the song because you have a dark second line on that. There's 2 lines at number 6, but they're equally 2 lines. And that is telling us it's the end of a section, not the end of the entire piece. And so that's the difference between 6 and 8 that they're pointing out for you. 7 is showing that there's a refrain. Oftentimes hymns are written in what we call a verse-refrain format. That means there's a verse, and then the refrain, when we get to it, we sing the same text and tune, where in the verses we sing the same tune but a different text each time. And then we already talked about 8. Number 9, that's just showing that there's often sometimes a separate text that's utilized for a different time of the year, or possibly a different moment in the service. So if it's a communion day or you're using it for communion, you can change the text around to help it kind of introduce that. And then finally, number 10 is giving us who actually created the music and where it came from. And what the nice thing is we get dates there that we can kind of get a sense of when the music was created and who did it. And then number 11 is the name of the tune. And we've talked about this a little bit before, but the name of the tune is very interesting of where they came from, because oftentimes the name of the tune came from either the place that it was written, sometimes the church or the city that it was written in, or the area of the country that it was written in. Sometimes it's related more in the more kind of modern pieces to the actual text that was connected to it. So for example, Hymn of Promise, the tune is called Promise because it's a modern tune that was written in the 20th century, and so they're connecting it to the text. But as you can see in these very early hymns, there wasn't one hymn tune that was connected to one text. And oftentimes, a lot of the early hymn writers, they didn't ever write the hymn knowing what tune people would sing it to. They would just write to a meter that they knew was fairly common so that people could find a hymn tune to connect it with. And then number 12 is that meter that we saw that we came up with, and it's literally because somebody is counting for the beauty of the earth, 7, for the glory of the sky, 7. And so you get 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7. That's the meter. And if you can find a tune that does that, then you've got a tune that works with this text. Any questions about kind of how we got to that? And please understand, I just jumped from 300 to 2000, in my kind of explanation quickly about how we got to it.
So Tim, those that were writing the tunes, what were they going by? I mean,
so there's two things. Most likely, so we've heard a lot about this idea that a lot of these tunes were bar songs. We actually, the historians have actually come to kind of break that that myth up a little bit in the last 15, 20 years of science or of history study. But what we do know is that they were familiar tunes. Oftentimes, they were either folk tunes or tunes that they learned as children. And so there were a set of tunes in each area that were very commonly used. And that's why oftentimes you can trace our hymns back to the country that they came from. We have Welsh hymns, we have Scottish hymns, we have British hymns, we have Italian hymns. So some of it can be traced back to the area based on the folk tunes that were popular in there. They might have been tunes that they sang in the bar, but there actually is less proof of that more and more these days. But probably what happened was, as Luther, as the Wesley brothers were looking to bring the church to the people, instead of, as what they believed the Catholic Church was doing, was trying to force the people to kind of come and meet the church and not really kind of make it accessible, was they were trying to make it as accessible as possible. And so they're gonna take a hymn, they're gonna write it to a meter of a tune that they already knew. Now, then there are writers who start to create new tunes for hymns, which a lot of the hymn tunes we have today went through a number of, or sorry, a lot of the hymns we have today went through a number of tunes because before somebody found one that they really liked for that text. But the people that were writing are then going to write in similar meters. So that's why there's certain meters that we have a ton of tunes that we can pick from. If you see CM or SM, those were very popular. And so if you look in the back of our hymnal, and I think that's actually our next slide, but let me see if I'm wrong about that. Yeah, if you look in the back of our hymnal, you will see this list of tunes. Now, if you look at, let's say, 6786, you're going to only see in that upper left-hand corner one tune, The Gift of Life. Now, that doesn't make it a bad tune. It just, there hasn't been a lot of, it wasn't a more common meter. But then if you go over and look at 8787, it starts at the bottom of the first page and goes all the way through the top. And so we have Give Me Jesus, Glorious Name, Greensleeves. If you know what Greensleeves is, it's a Christmas tune. Now the name of it's gone out of my head. But there's all these hymn tunes that can be sung to 8787. And so it just is the ones that became more popular because there are already songs written in that meter, and so they wrote text to fit them, and then people then started writing tunes to fit that same meter as well. Did that answer your question, Katie? So it's a mixture of things, but what we really understand is that it was all kind of first inspired by folk tunes. All right, so then we get to a hymn that we all probably are familiar with, Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence. Now this is from one of the first printed instances we know of this. But this hymn tune, Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence, is one of the earliest Christian hymns that is still in common usage. Its roots date back to the 4th century, and it is based on the Greek text known as the Prayer of the Cherubic Hymn in the Liturgy of St. James. So now, since it's being written in the 4th century, this was originally written to be more like a Gregorian chant. Okay? According to hymnologist Albert Bailey, the ancient liturgy of St. James originated with the church at Jerusalem and is sometimes called the Liturgy of Jerusalem. Originally, it was thought to have been the work of James the Lesser, the brother of Jesus, but now seems to have been created under Cyril of Jerusalem circa 347 and was later amplified. In performance, this liturgy leads up to the celebration of the Eucharist, our communion. Since the Eucharist was an awesome rite in which, according to universal ancient belief, Christ was actually present under the guise of bread and wine, this is of course written by a Catholic, it should be approached only after due spiritual preparation. So that's some text from a writing that was found along with this hymn. Before it would be sung, the celebrant would say the following preface during the Eucharistic liturgy, setting the context for the hymn. We remember the sky, the earth and the sea, the sun and the moon, the stars and all creation, both rational and irrational, the angels and archangels, powers, mights, dominations, principalities, thrones, the many-eyed cherubim who say those words of David, praise the Lord with me. We remember the seraphim whom Isaiah saw in spirit standing around the throne of God, who with 2 wings covered their faces, with 2 their feet, and with 2 fly, who say, Holy, 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 Lord of Sabbath. We also say these divine words of the seraphim so as to take part in the hymns of the heavenly host. And then this hymn would be sung. There was one other thing I wanted to tell you about this. Give me one second in my notes. So in the original liturgy of St. James, the hymn was used as the bread and wine were brought into the sanctuary. So if you've ever been to a very high Catholic church, they actually would, they call it the offering, which is interesting, and that usually is oftentimes mixed with while the plates are being passed for the congregation to give their money, but at the exact same time, the offering is also being brought forward of Jesus's body and blood, or the bread and the wine, at the same moment. And so they see this kind of as a reciprocal thing. The people are giving of themselves because Jesus gave of himself. And so that's what he's talking about here, as they're being brought into the sanctuary. And so this song would be sung as that moment is happening. So why I wanted to kind of talk about this one is that for me, this is a hymn that we often sing at Christmas time, because it's very much about the coming of Jesus to earth in childlike form. But because of the way that the liturgy worked in the Catholic Church, it really was for them, and still is for them, and actually is even in our hymnal listed as a communion hymn. So anyway, so this is what it would have looked like. They would have done this. But here's the original tune that we think that was originally written for this, or the first one at least that was written down. Now you'll see it's called it says, you'll see the title, and then under it, Cherubic Hymn for Holy Saturday, and then under that it says Plagal First Mode. So that is actually the key in which it was played in. Remember when we talked about early church music, we talked about the fact that they didn't have the key of C, the key of D. They had these modes that they worked in, right? And so this would have been the tune that they would have sung this to. But again, remember, we're in the Catholic Church. So this is not a tune that everybody in this congregation is going to be able to sing. This is actually not an easy tune at all. Let all more that's the tune. Aren't you glad we don't sing that one today? So again, this is really what sets apart, even though this is a text that's handed down from the 4th century, this was how it would have been originally done. Then at some point, a Protestant came along and said, nobody can sing that. This should be a text everybody can sing. And so a Protestant came and put it to a tune that was more familiar and able to be sung by the people. And then this is how we get to the text. So this is a version of it in how it would have been written in around the 1700s. And again, notice the text is still below the music. So if you don't read music well, which again, we have an understanding that the early church, as the Protestant movement happens, more and more people get to learn how to read music because it became an important part of you celebrating your religion, right? And so you see, ba da 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 dee da 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 da, and here we have marked above French traditional carol. So that's telling us that this tune had to have come probably from France. But again, the text was written in the 4th century, many years before probably this tune ever came about. And very likely this tune had nothing to do with this text when it was originally written. It was probably a song about, you know, the shepherdess falling in love with the shepherd. And then some Protestant pastor said, oh, we can put that to that text. And this is how we get this. So this would be how you would have read your hymns until the middle of the 19th century. And then we finally get to the one that comes out of our hymnal. So again, let's look at a couple of things. If we look down at the bottom of the page, we see that the words are still attributed to the liturgy of St. James, even though we know probably now that St. James had nothing to do with it. But it says it was written in the 4th century. We find out who translated this text into English, Gerard Moultrie, in somewhere around 1864. And then they give us also a sense of what was the biblical inspiration for this text. So John 6:35 to 58 and Revelations 4 are the biblical inspiration. Now, I don't think that that's something we know definitively. I think it's something that a theologian came back around later instead and said, this is where they're kind of getting this information. I don't think it's that hard to find because these early texts especially would have matched biblical texts fairly closely. But just so you know kind of where that came from. Then under that, we find out that, yes, it's a French carol medley. Now, carols are something that we associate only with Christmas, but there were carols written for every time of the church in the 16th and 17th century. So it's very possible that it could have been written as a carol for Easter or a carol for Pentecost. And then they decided to also attach it to this text. And then we see that this harmonization, so the melody is a French carol melody, but it's harmonized. The other two notes within the harmony of the piece comes from the English hymnal. Now, why it doesn't give us a name is because we don't know who wrote the harmonization. The early hymnals, and again, this comes with that argument of in the church of should we give credit to the person or did God inspire this, and so really the person doesn't deserve credit for it. And so that's why in these early hymnals, very often they do not give any credit to the harmonizer or to the writer of the tune or the text. And so we just have that the harmonization was taken from the English hymnal, which we think was written about 1906. And then finally on the right, the tune gets the name Picardy. Again, this comes back to an area of France. And so that tells us that probably that idea that it came from a French carol melody is probably pretty straight on. And then the meter is written below that, 878787, which is a fairly common meter. Any questions about kind of how we got to what it looks like and where we get why I chose this one first is I wanted to show you how the text from the 4th century, but this tune probably came somewhere around the 16th, 17th century. So separate in their time frame of when they came together for now what we consider it to be, and we couldn't even think about this text really with another tune easily. Yeah? Awesome. So I thought that we would end our evening singing that beautiful hymn. I found this great recording from a church in Lincoln, Nebraska. The organist is a really famous organist, Tom Trenny. We've actually sung a couple of his pieces in the past, and we'll probably sing more of those. He's a great professor and a composer of music, as well as just a fine musician and a really beautiful human being. I've had a wonderful time to get to meet him in the past, and I really like him a lot. But anyway, this is a congregation singing it, so I thought it would be appropriate to sing along. There will be a long introduction because he's a very fine organist, and so he's going to do the really wonderful organ thing for a little bit before it starts. So I promise it does start. I should also say, please make sure that your microphones are turned off, because if we all sing together with our microphones turned on, it will sound a mess. But if we sing alone and just let the music be with us, then we can do that. Amen.